everybody. Have any of you ever wondered why something as simple as setting a deadline can mean something really different in one place than another? Or maybe a promise that's made in one culture might not carry the same weight as in another. In this globalized business environment, it's really important to understand how our expectations, or maybe even our assumptions, can be a little bit different and maybe not be exactly what we had intended. I'd like to welcome everybody to Global Gals, where we're going to be exploring these intricacies of cross-cultural environments. I'm Maria Garaitonandia, together with Monalu Shirkawi, and today we have Anna Shildrick. So let's plunge into this whole world of expectations. And I know, Mona, we were just talking about this. You have a great little story I'd love for you to share.
Yeah, well, thank you, Maria. And every time somebody speaks about assumptions, speaks about expectations, I cannot help it but refer to a parable. When I ask people, do you know it? They say they've never heard of it. So let's share that with the viewer because we can learn a lot of lessons from it. The Mexican fisherman and the American stockbroker. So, an American investment banker came across a Mexican fisherman who had caught few fish. And the banker asked the Mexican fisherman, "Why are you leaving? Why don't you stay longer than this? You can catch more fish." And the fisherman replied that he had enough to meet his family's needs. And then he spent the rest of the time, he explained that he spent the rest of his time relaxing, sleeping late, enjoying siestas and talking to his children, to his wife Maria, and also chilling with the friends in the evening and playing music and dancing mariachis. So the banker arrogantly proposed a plan for the fisherman to expand his business into this huge corporate empire. And he gave him the plan over 15 to 20 years so he could make millions and retire rich. So the fisherman was following through when the American was proposing. And then at the end, he said, "And then what?" The banker said, "Well, after you accumulate all these millions of dollars, you can sell your company and just come back, return to your village and live the life you live in, relaxing and doing exactly what you already are doing." This sometimes when I mention this parable, the American stockbroker is thinking about life differently than the Mexican. For the American, success means accumulating wealth, building empires, being rich. But for the Mexican, is the opposite, is having quality time, relaxing, playing his guitar. And that's the ultimate happiness for the Mexican man. And also for the American, when he saw that he was fishing every day and he's catching enough fish for his family, he wanted him to do more. However, he found that for some reason he found it unfulfilling. It's not fulfilling life. You need more. You need more. So when we are talking about assumption, expectations, and what we want the others to do, we forget that people view the world through different lenses, that people have different attitude towards everything. And we cannot assume, we cannot expect anything from anyone. And all we can do is ask, share, and respect. You can take it from here, Maria.
I love that parable. It's just the idea of, how you get there and what your idea is, whether you're taking your siesta in a nice little hut or in a grand palace, but it's the quality of life.
Yeah.
And I'd love to get your take, Anna, being a global nomad yourself. What are maybe an example of some of the things that you've experienced in your trajectory in your life?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me today. So as you know, I'm British and I lived in several countries, but I moved to Mexico about 30 years ago and experienced culture shock, real culture shock for the first time. I had experienced culture shock, but European culture shock. And I think there are levels of culture shock, and I hadn't anticipated the level of culture shock that I was going to feel when I got to Mexico. And just as you were saying, Mona, the assumptions are what cause the assumptions create our expectations, and we have to be aware of those assumptions. And I think for many years I wasn't aware of my assumptions. I just came in with, this is me, this is who I am. And that learning journey of really sitting down and taking note of what my assumptions and my biases are has helped me to really adapt to this culture. So one of the hardest things for me at the beginning was the work environment, because I started working immediately in an all Mexican work environment using Spanish, which I didn't even really have. I had to kind of grab the language quickly, but that wasn't too much of a problem. It was the expectations of, for example, sitting around a table for a meeting to which I would arrive 10 minutes before to be able to, get myself at the table and have everything ready, and then be the only person at the table for about 20 minutes or 30 minutes and before other people came along. And then this expectation that we would all put our thoughts on the table and discuss one by one in order to, to reach some kind of conclusion. And that wasn't at all what happened. We would spend another 10 or 15 minutes greeting each other and asking each other about their mother-in-laws or their grandparents or, football matches at the weekend. And I would be, what's going on? Why aren't we getting to business? What's wrong with these people? The expectation, the assumption that I had was that a work meeting was about these goals that we had, prescribed for the meeting, when in actual fact, here in Mexico, the connecting with the people first is of utmost importance. So my judgment of the people was entirely erroneous when I thought that they were unprofessional, or I thought that they were just not taking the job seriously. And that caused a huge amount of movement in me. How am I going to work with these people? How are we ever going to achieve an objective? But little by little, I understood. And when, Maria was kind enough to lend me her books from, Edward Hall of Fons Trompenas, and I read about the different cultures, and I learned, relationship over objective is a thing here in Mexico. This is what it's about. And understanding that helped me to modify my expectations and to adapt. It was a learning curve, I can tell you.
That's a really good story. And you see that usually in cultures that are more relationship versus task oriented, you're going to have a lot of these disconnects. Also, the whole question of time, which you also brought up. What is on time? For you, it was being there 5 to 10 minutes early, whereas maybe for many of your colleagues, it was being there within 5 to 10 minutes after, and then giving that little buffer for breaking the ice. And then maybe at around quarter after or 20 after, that's when things start. So for you, 30 minutes have gone by and nothing has been done. And it can cause a lot of angst and frustration if your expectation is to do things the way that you're used to doing it, right? Whereas, if you come in with a little bit more of an open mind, a little more tolerance of just observing and going with the flow, you probably won't be quite as frustrated.
I think that's the key. I think that's the key is, when you do travel and live in other countries, and, I was taught by my father, who had lived in countries around the world, wherever you go, mouth closed, ears open, listen, watch, observe, learn. And I thought I was doing that, but I wasn't. I was judging because of my biases, my assumptions, my expectations. But it has been beautiful to understand, wow, the power of relationships in business. That's extremely important. That's something I would like to take when I go back to the UK. We just have to open our minds and see that there are things that can irk us and that can really boil our blood sometimes, but there are so many other things that we need to learn. And, I have 2 bicultural children who have the benefit of having, 2 distinct cultures, and they feel that this has enriched their lives enormously. Could take the best of both worlds.
Here's another example that Anna, you're very familiar with. I like to do a lot of entertaining. And sometimes I would ask my friends, hey, let me know if you're coming or not. And usually people who, some of them, the people that are from more task-oriented cultures might say, yes, I'll be there, or no, I can't make it. But most of my friends who are more relationship-oriented would say, yes, of course. And then maybe a few days later might say, oh, you know what? I'm so sorry. I forgot that I have X, Y, or Z. Or, oh, you know, or at the last minute, some of them would just not show up. And that would really irk me, because my expectation was, if I'm getting something catered, I don't want to be wasting food or whatever. And somebody else could come in your place. And I don't mind if you tell me you can't come from the beginning. But many of my friends would say, well, Maria, here in this country, it's not so nice to say no from the get-go, because it kind of sounds like you're not even putting in an effort. So you kind of go with the, you know, you feign that, yes, of course, I will be there. And then you come up with the excuse, or then you give the person the news that, oh, I'm so sorry, I hadn't really considered this or that. But it shows that at least you're making an effort, and you're trying to be as kind and as considerate as you can. So that was something that for me was very, very interesting, because my expectation was, hey, if you can't come, it's no big deal. But for them, it was, it's kind of not nice because you've made the effort to invite me, and I want to seem like at least I'd love to go, but I'm not going to say no from the beginning. And so
Um, that's like in the Lewis model attitude towards truth. Truth is yes, yes, no, no, but it may be, and I will think about it. And also, it depends what the relationship you have with these people as well. How are they ranking you? Do they have a high regard towards who you are as a person or not? And sometimes it's hard to say no to the person. It doesn't have to be in a Mexican environment or any other environment. Just within family members, sometimes you don't want to say no just because you respect that person. You have a high regard towards that person. And we see that in a lot in the Asian cultures as well. But the question or the comment that I have, or the observation that I have based on what Anna and Maria are talking about, is we're always going into a situation from the standpoint of us judging others, or us evaluating others, or us looking at others doing it differently. But we never sit down and ask ourselves, why am I the way I am? Who am I? And evaluate who we are before we can go and evaluate anybody else in terms of time, in terms of business, in terms of relationships, so on and so forth. I mean, have you ever asked yourself that question? Because so often the way we are is relatively connected with genetics, and our behavior, whatever we are going to display in adulthood, has been already laid down for us generations before. I mean, we don't want to switch the topic, but it's just an observation that who we are is something that we need to start looking into first. That way we can understand. It'll be easier for us to understand others. How often do you get a comment that you sound like your auntie so-so, or you look like your grandmother so-so? So that through generations, we've been carrying this, I'm not going to call it a burden, is a beautiful thing, but we've been carrying a luggage called culture, habits, values, assumptions, expectations that we have never sat down and evaluated.
I agree with you. And I think that you raised something that's essential for me in my life, in my work, the way that I work. Cultural intelligence, emotional intelligence, all of this knowledge and consciousness of self. You know, I tried to talk about metacognition a lot in my work. I work in education. That's my main field. I work in lots of different fields, but my main field is education. And what I'm trying to achieve at the moment is incorporating metacognition into the education system, building it into curriculum. Because if we from day one have learning opportunities to analyze who we are, how we function, why we think the way that we think, you know, how can I change the way that I think? How do I learn? Why do I learn that way? What strategies do I have? Just the understanding of self, I think, could eliminate so many societal problems that we have today. But we don't question ourselves so many times. And that's why culture, and I see it so many times when I go back to the UK and I look at neighbors, or, you know, people who've never moved away from the UK, and I can see have you questioned why you live this way? Have you questioned why you answer in that way? Have you questioned why your expectations are set up in this way? But I don't think that we necessarily do until we step out of that context. Then we look back at that context and say, wow, that's different. We open our perspective when we travel, or when we, change from one, it could be even just from one company to another company, business culture. Mm-hmm. But it's that change and seeing another culture which can invite us to open our eyes and analyze our own culture. But I do think that it should be something that we do from birth, is recognize, oh, I was born into this place in the world. I was born into this culture. This is, do I invest in this, or do I want to open my mind to other ideas? I think that metacognition allows us to understand who we are and allows us to make better choices when it is that we're encountering other human beings.
It is a lot to unpack. And once you realize where you're coming from, what your filters are, when we talk about culture is something that you learn and you share. It's a collective programming that distinguishes one group from another. So the first group that's going to influence you is your family. Your family values, your culture, that's your first culture. And then you start sharing it further and further, with your schoolmates, with your neighbors, etc., like a fish in water. And if you have no reason to question it, if you have no exchange with the outer world, it's hard to realize that you have the water surrounding you if you're a fish, unless they pull you out and you start squirming like, oh, So that's when you start realizing. But it would be wonderful, just like emotional intelligence, just like other things. I think it would be so helpful in curriculum to teach this to children, because ultimately then when we start interacting in the global environment, which we are now, it's a reality. Virtually everybody's pretty much dealing with everybody in almost every part of the planet anymore. It's not, it's the rule rather the exception, as it used to be 20 years ago. Then it would be so much easier for these interactions.
Yeah.
So that's part of the reason why having this interpersonal intelligence, whether it's the cultural intelligence or the emotional intelligence, is so important to develop, so that things just flow a lot easier.
And the same goes with diversity and inclusion as a subject. Yeah, we are conducting a lot of diversity and inclusion trainings, and I sometimes say, well, this should have been done at early age, not now, because you will find a hard time changing somebody at 40 or 50. Or, I mean, he's accustomed and he has been trained, programs to do things certain way, to believe certain way, and all of a sudden you're coming in to tell him, hey, diversity and inclusion, and this is that. The effect of those trainings perhaps are just at the surface, just to check a number, but in terms of working with the mind and doing self-evaluation, it almost doesn't work. Because sometimes you find it impossible for somebody to accept new ideas at a certain age. Yeah, she will say, yeah, we should do this, but is he or she doing it from really the bottom of their heart? They believe in it. They believe in what they're doing. Perhaps not, but they just check in the paperwork or check in whatever and say, yeah, this is diversity inclusion. We'll have a number of people from this race, from that color, from this gender, from that. But is it creating the environment that we strive to have? And I always question these questions. I mean, we can go back to our assumption and expectations. I don't want to get into deeper topics, but I'm just saying, here's another example that we can mention in terms of what we were talking about, as far as things that we have to start learning from early age.
But is it maybe, sorry, Maria, go ahead.
No, I think it all depends also what the motivation is. I mean, you were mentioning courses. It's very different to have that natural curiosity, or even the need, because now you find yourself doing business globally, or having a team that's a lot more diverse. And it's another thing when there are just policies and procedures imposed on you. So I think that's probably part of the difference between being motivated to learn something new or see something from a different perspective, and or feeling that it's just you're checking off a box like you just mentioned.
Yeah.
I don't know. What were you going to say, Anna?
Just, is it maybe an assumption that everybody is, wanting the diversity?
Exactly.
Is that an assumption that we make? So, we have to look at who's in the room and why. And again, if you have that understanding of yourself, no, I think I believe this because, and I'm happy to believe in this because, the awareness of why we think the way that we do, then you can have, intellectual conversations about these things rather than walls or wars that can be caused because we just truly blindly believe something that we believe, and we don't necessarily have the full understanding of why we do. And what you said, Mona, took me back to when I first moved here, the societal expectations. I had no idea that I was expected to never separate from my husband, no matter what, and that I would receive some kind of backlash from society for doing so. I didn't realize that because I hadn't fully considered other people's expectations. I considered my own and how that would have gone down, in my own culture. That was another big shock to me of, what does it mean to separate in a culture where traditionally marriages kind of last and last and last, whether they're thriving or not. And that is about the expectations that people have, and that affects the way that you're seen professionally. It can affect your whole community that you may have built. There's so many, consequences of making decisions without fully understanding the context that you're living in. For me, it's been 30 years of learning. I think I've kind of got it now. I think I've got a handle on it now. But there are still things that I think I can still be surprised by. That there's violence in Mexico, and I can still be surprised by people finding humor in very, very difficult situations.
And
I can
that
still find
stems
that hard.
the expectation of never being separated from your husband. That's the religious Catholic culture, right? So if you're from outside, you'll be questioning that, right? But then again, you have to, like they say, when in Rome, you have to do like Romans do, right?
Now, let me ask you a question, just to kind of bring it all together. What kind of practical learning do you think people can take from some of these experiences we've shared? What are some good ideas as far as aligning expectations if you're working cross-culturally?
I'll jump in, Maria, because I think now that I do work with people from all over the world, I work remotely with people from lots of different countries now. One of the very first actions that I try to take is to establish a conversation around our expectations of how we're going to work. What are the team expectations? What can each person expect to give or not give? The timeliness. I think just opening the conversation I always start with, hey, I'm British, by the way. If I'll be there on time or probably earlier. Don't feel the pressure, but I will be. Or I'll say, perhaps you may find me very direct. I will try, to be aware of other people's communication styles, but I'm British, so if you find me very direct. So I think just putting those things on the table has been very useful for me and the teams in which I work, because I'm very aware of how other people may view me. I think that's, rather than me being aware of what I may get from them, which is extremely important, it's been really, really important for me that I'm aware of how they could view me, because then I can just avoid some of the pitfalls, or I can just smooth the path a little bit.
Okay, so that sounds like establishing expectations, maybe establishing a little bit of a disclaimer there in order to, hey, this is who I am, don't get scared. Do you have any tips or any suggestions there too to align the expectations?
Like I said, I am starting to ask myself a lot of questions, and I do a lot of self-evaluations. And when I work with people from all over the world, and just this week has been rough with so many things happening with working with people from different backgrounds and different cultures, I go in without expecting anything or assuming anything, because I do not want to find myself in a position of disappointment. Then I'll start asking myself question, well, why didn't I do it that way? Why should I should have done it that way? So there is a lot of retrospective moments that I have and evaluate myself, and also going in without expecting anything, not assuming anything. And
Okay.
that's actually, it has been freeing. It
Mhm.
has been really good, because so often I used to go to, I'm assuming that these people know this, or they should do it that way, whatever. And when it doesn't happen, there's almost a loss of friendship, loss of relationship, and or even sometimes arguments. But it's not like I argue, but perhaps there are arguments that transpires from situation like this. But what what should we do? What should we do? So it starts with us. It starts with us. No assumptions, no expectations. If you do it that way, I respect it. I just sometimes I will not understand why you're doing it that way. And perhaps I would love to understand why, in case I encounter someone else with the same traits or behavior, I am ready and I process it as easy as possible. So my question to you, Anna, after having uh, after being in Mexico for 30 years, you said, right? And you are seeing all these differences and perhaps sometimes discrepancies. Have you adapted your ways to the Mexican way, or you still tell them, okay, well, I'll be early. I am British. I'll be early. Expect that. Or have you adapted to the way, or
Yeah. Let me tell you, it's not just with Mexico as well, because I've worked with a lot of people in Asia. I've worked with people from around the world. And what I've done that has worked for me is to educate myself on other people's culture. So not just only no assumptions, but also a little bit of understanding of who I'm going to be talking to, who I'm going to be dealing with. For example, I was teaching business English for a long, long time. And I knew that, for example, my subset of students who from Asia were less likely to actually raise a hand and speak out unless called on. And that it wasn't that they didn't understand, it was I was understanding in their culture that it was much less likely for them to do that. And so what I've managed to change are the things, not my essence, because I can't change my essence, and I've kept the cultural aspects of me that I like, but I have adapted to avoid any kind of bumpy water. Anything that I know that if I walk in with this, it's gonna cause a problem. For example, Maria, you know my whole story about going to the national healthcare system here, and expecting to have an appointment on time, to see a doctor, etc., and then facing a whole cultural experience that I wasn't expecting, and me getting very angry and upset, and then not being able to get an appointment, etc. Now I know exactly how to walk in, and I know exactly what I'm expecting, and I know how I need to speak. So I have adapted to all the things that will make my relationship with others much more fruitful.
Yes, because
And I think that,
you're not going to change the whole world to adapt to you, right? You need to
of
be
course not.
flexible and have that conversation. I think another key thing is developing trust, so that when you have that communication, you can establish the cards on the table, establish a little bit of this humor in hey, this is, don't get scared, this is how we are. So I think all of these are very good pieces of advice for anybody who's going to be working cross culturally,
Mhm.
whether in person or virtually. And anything else that you think that we've forgotten or you want to add for our listeners before we close?
There's so much we could talk about.
I
So
know
much. I mean, we could keep going for
a whole
hours.
series on this.
Well, at least give people a tip, final tip as far as expectation and assumption. Um, uh, any strategies that they can benefit from, utilize to avoid any type of confrontation or disappointment.
Well, to me, it was reading. It was reading and learning about culture. I mean, I've read a lot, and I've learned the theory. I've read great cultural theorists, and all of that has made sense for me. It's like, okay, I get that now. That, but it's retrospective. Of course, it would have been much smoother ride had I actually learned about this, which is again why I work in education, because I feel that there's so much more that we could be doing to help humans thrive in their world. So that would be my tip. Read up who you're going to be working with. Read up on the culture. You know, give yourself a little bit of a step ahead so you can avoid some of those pitfalls.
All right. Well, that's a good tip. Here you have it, our listeners and viewers. Read, get prepared, seek help, ask questions. It's always good to ask questions and go into a field that is not your original field. Go on in with your best foot. Absorb, take, and ask questions if you don't understand. And respect everybody, because I tell people there's no culture that is better than another culture. There's just different cultures, and our jobs is to understand that difference, respect it, take what you like from it and leave what you don't like from it. Life is good, and we're all here for a short period of time. How can we make it the best experience for us and for others?
Here, here.
Here.
Okay, well, thank you so very much. Until next time, stay well and stay curious.
Thanks, Mona.